The Dutch colonization of Indonesia is a complex and multifaceted historical narrative that spans over 3 centuries, leaving a profound and lasting impact on the archipelago's culture, society, and economy. This essay delves into the intricate details of how the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and subsequently the Dutch colonial government established control over Indonesia, exploring the motivations, methods, and consequences of this colonial enterprise. The story of Dutch colonization in Indonesia begins in the early 17th century when the VOC, a powerful trading company established by the Dutch government, sought to dominate the lucrative spice trade in the East Indies. Indonesia, with its abundance of spices such as cloves, nutmeg, and pepper, became a focal point of Dutch commercial interests. Initially establishing trading posts and alliances with local rulers, the VOC gradually expanded its influence across the Indonesian archipelago. The VOC operated as a quasi-governmental entity, possessing its own military forces and administrative structures. This unique arrangement allowed the Dutch to effectively monopolize trade and exert control over local economies. Through a combination of diplomacy, coercion, and military force, the VOC established a network of fortified trading posts, known as factories, and effectively controlled key ports and trade routes. As the VOC's influence grew, so did its ambitions. The company began to intervene more directly in local politics, often siding with local rulers who were willing to grant them trade concessions or exclusive rights. This strategy enabled the Dutch to undermine indigenous power structures and expand their territorial control. By the late 18th century, the VOC had effectively transformed from a trading company into a territorial power in its own right, controlling substantial parts of Java, Sumatra, and the Moluccas. With the dissolution of the VOC in 1799, the Dutch government took direct control over its colonial possessions in Indonesia. Under Dutch colonial rule, which lasted until the mid-20th century, Indonesia became known as the Dutch East Indies. The colonial administration implemented a system of governance that prioritized Dutch interests while exploiting Indonesian resources and labor. Economically, the Dutch implemented a system of forced cultivation, known as the culture system or cultuurstelsel, whereby local farmers were required to dedicate a portion of their land and labor to produce export crops for the Dutch government. This system not only enriched the colonial administration but also disrupted traditional agrarian economies and exacerbated social inequality. Dutch colonization had profound cultural and social consequences for Indonesia. The imposition of Western education, legal systems, and Christianity led to the erosion of indigenous cultural practices and identities. At the same time, resistance to Dutch rule, both passive and active, fostered a sense of nationalism and unity among the diverse ethnic and cultural groups of the archipelago. The ultimate legacy of Dutch colonization in Indonesia was the emergence of a nationalist movement that ultimately led to independence. Beginning in the early 20th century, Indonesian intellectuals and political leaders, inspired by nationalist movements around the world, began to mobilize against Dutch colonial rule. The Japanese occupation of Indonesia during World War II further weakened Dutch control and provided opportunities for nationalist leaders such as Sukarno and Hatta to gain prominence.